Thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this, the show of Selena. I'm delighted to be part of this wonderful institution, the McNay, which is something San Antonio should be and is very, very proud of. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about how I came to shoot the pictures of Selena and give you a little bit of background about me. I've been shooting pictures for, well, let's round it off, 50 years. I headed in the early 70s, I headed to the University of Texas to get a degree in the history of art. And while I was there, I was lucky enough to study with a couple of photographers, very famous photographers, and I got bitten by the photography bug and I've never looked back. This morning I want to talk to you a little bit about the difference between taking photographs and making photographs, which is central to my approach to taking pictures. The first photographer that I came under the influence of was Russell Lee at UT. Some of you may recognize that name. He made his reputation in the 30s during the Depression. This is Russ at work. He was part of a government group called the Farm Securities Administration that was sent out west to document poverty in this country. Everybody knew that times were tough during the Depression, but people in big cities back east, they had it tough, but they didn't know how tough it was on the farms and ranches and little towns out west of the Mississippi. And it was a government propaganda effort to send these photographers, all of whom just about became famous, to document the extreme poverty on farms and ranches. Little kids were literally starving to death. These photographers were charged with taking pictures of that and then sending it back, and it was put in newspapers and magazines and illustrated to people on the East Coast how bad it really was, which made the Roosevelt administration's plans for alleviating the poverty easier, so people could really understand how bad it was. Russ was a photographer that entered into a situation and had to get permission to shoot. If you think about going to Wisdom, Montana in 1932 in the depths of the Depression, and your job is to document poverty, you have to go out on somebody's ranch, and you have to get permission to do that. Now imagine how hard that might be to do, to go out and introduce yourself. You're in a car, you've got a coat and tie on, you're a big city type guy, and you're driving up to a house and talking to a rancher who is not able to feed his family, and you're saying, I want to take pictures of you. How, in this day and age, how many times would you get no slammed in your face? And somehow he was able to do that. Somehow he was able to break down the barrier between who he was and who they were and get these unbelievably intimate photographs of the way people lived, some of which are what he saw when he went inside these houses, some of which you can kind of see his hand in arranging something. I think it's possible to say this probably was arranged, where that little child was looking in the mirror and the crack in the mirror goes right down his face. Russ's photographs are heartbreaking because they not only show the abject poverty, but they show the toll it's taken on people. In order to get a picture like this, you have to be in the right place at the right time with your camera ready to go, and then you have to see that moment, and you have to react to that moment. You can't see this moment and then start fiddling with your camera. I forgot to put film in, my exposure isn't set right. Oh, I left my camera in the car. This moment happens, what? A thousandth of a second, and it's gone. If you're not there to capture that moment, it's lost forever. This tells a whole novel. This is one of my favorite photographs that he did. This is clearly set up, and it's lighted. Russ was one of the first guys to use a flash on camera in interiors, which is a very direct, straight light that lights an interior. Doesn't have any character much because it comes straight from the camera. But you can see the shadows behind the people. This is lighted with a flash. And believe it or not, back when he did this, this was a novel thing to do, to put a flash on a camera and shoot an interior. But this woman, this is clearly an arranged shot. This woman is teaching her children to read, ostensibly. And if you can see it, I don't know if you can see it, but up the top sentence it says, "The rain are fallen." The rain are fallen. Garry Winogrand replaced Russ at UT. I took a year of classes with Russell Lee, and then Garry Winogrand was hired, and he was completely the opposite kind of photographer. He was a real tough, streetwise street photographer from New York, generation younger. He approached photography in a totally different way. Let's say that Russell Lee, we can say, was making photographs. And I'll expand on that idea a little bit more. Garry Winogrand takes photographs. And again, we'll talk about the difference. Garry Winogrand's approach to photography was to use a very small, exquisite little German 35mm film camera. Remember, this is all film. And walk through reality. And as his eye would catch something that was interest to him, he would quickly, very quickly take a picture of it. He had his camera ready at all times. He was always kind of like a magpie. Everything interested him. He was an omnivore. Everything was of possible interest to him. And the idea was something would catch his eye, then he'd throw the frame of his camera around it and capture everything around it. And the trick is to get everything in the photograph that needs to be there, that's supposed to be there, and nothing in the photograph that shouldn't be there. His photographs are very mysterious. His photographs ask more questions than they answer. You look at his pictures and you go, I don't get this. What's going on here? And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to work with the whole idea of photography. What does photographing something, what effect does that have on the something? And he would always say, once you take a picture of something, then it's not the something any longer, now it's the photograph. And the photograph is something different than what you took pictures of. I fell under the influence of Garry Winogrand early because he was such a strong personality, and the way he described what he was doing was so compelling. It was easy for a student to think this is the only legitimate, pure way to shoot pictures. So I started taking Garry Winogrand pictures. And they're not very good. And they never were real satisfying because I never was very comfortable with this idea of taking pictures. If you walk through reality with a little camera, see something out of the corner of your eye, go snap, right? Yeah. People have a natural suspicion about having their pictures made. There's an apocryphal story about the archaeologists or anthropologists that first went into Africa 125 years ago and discovered a tribe that had never seen outsiders. And they had a big camera with them. And they explained what the camera did. It would record something, a face, and then they showed them a print. This is what happens. And then they wanted to take pictures of some of the people in this tribe, and they were absolutely horrified. No, you can't do that because you're taking something from me. Taking something from me. And we sort of chuckled at that. Oh, isn't that naive and primitive? But the fact of the matter is we feel the same way. If I walk around and I stick my camera in your face and then walk away, your reaction is, wait a minute, what happened? You just took my image, my presence here in this world is mine, and you just took something from me. That's real for all of us still now, and I never felt really comfortable doing that. Although sometimes the payoff is not bad. You catch a moment, and some of them are satisfying, I guess, but again, it was not comfortable. So I decided, of those two, taking pictures and making pictures, I was much more comfortable with making pictures. Making pictures, the photographer and the subject work together, conspire together to coordinate and to make a photograph together. You have the subject's permission, you have the subject's participation in what you're doing, And together you make a photograph as opposed to taking a photograph. So I realized the kind of personality I am. I like people, I like talking to people, when you're photographing people, you kind of work on a dual track. You're talking to them and breaking down the barrier, the natural barrier people have about having their picture made. Nobody really likes having their picture made. They're always a little bit nervous. You break that barrier down, hopefully, get that person comfortable, but at the same time you're thinking about f-stop and shutter speed and where's my light and what's the background look like and should I put them over here, should I put them over here? So you got both sides of your brain working real hard. Oops. Now, I also realized that I like to shoot what's called larger format, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. We all know what 35 millimeter is. We've seen slides in the closet full of dust that we don't look at any longer. That's a very small piece of film. There are larger pieces of film and larger cameras that are available to photographers. There's a piece of film that's 2¼ inches by 2¼ inches. There's a piece of film that's 4 by 5 inches. And each one has more and more information on it, more detail, more accuracy in a way. And I realized that I like to see a lot of information in my photographs, so I almost exclusively shot the medium format, 2¼ by 2¼ or larger format, 4 by 5 inches. And they're slower cameras to use. You can't shoot your camera like a machine gun, just bam, 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 which is the way Garry Winogrand would work. You had to shoot slower, there are less exposures on a roll of film and so forth. This was done with a 4 by 5 camera. And the edge around the photo is a remnant of the kind of film that I used in that camera, which is no longer made. It was Polaroid, a Polaroid film. You would shoot it in your camera, you'd peel it apart. We know what Polaroids are. You'd have a black and white print over here, and over here you'd have a really high quality negative that you could soup and dry out and then use to make multiples of it. And I like to print the edge around the photo sort of to underscore the kind of film I used when I was shooting it. This is Johnny Rodriguez. I don't know if you remember him, very prominent singer in Texas. This is a Cree Indian from Canada. The key to leaving aside the kind of technical stuff, the human stuff when you're photographing is again to break down that barrier between the photographer and the subject so that they feel comfortable. If you're about to photograph somebody and you say, okay, I'm about to take a picture, and then you go, oops, and the camera falls off the tripod, or you've forgotten to put the exposure and you've forgotten to load it with film, if you start bumbling around, that person immediately starts tightening up. That person immediately starts, oh, wait a minute, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's doing. You have to be ready to go. This was shot with another kind of that Polaroid film that I was telling you about. And if anybody should be suspicious of me taking a picture, it would be this guy. And so the key for him was to somehow convince him that I was on his side, that I wanted to celebrate his beauty and the beauty of his costume and the beauty of his heritage, and not take advantage of him, and not put him on Facebook with a mustache painted on his face and that sort of thing. And it's hard to do, but it's possible to do, and it's very gratifying when you do it to get a look like this where his inner poise, his inner elegance comes through. That doesn't just happen. You have to create the atmosphere where he feels comfortable enough to project who he is, in a way, to the camera. You can take a flat picture of somebody who is recoiling from the lens in front of them, who's closed off, who's put a kind of an invisible barrier down. And you can see the difference. Sir?
Yeah, quick question. Do you get just a verbal consent, or do you always also get a written consent?
Well, almost always verbal. And that's a mistake I've made over the years because I work so quickly, and then sometimes I don't think of the paperwork. And it would be better to get a written consent, you're right. But because of the way the law is written, I have certain rights to those photographs with just a verbal consent. I don't have all the rights to those photographs. Did you? Yes?
Do you meet with the person ahead of time?
No, this was...
How does that develop?
This was going on up in Browning, Montana, which is the Blackfeet Agency, Blackfeet Indian Tribe Agency, their headquarters. Every year, the end of June, I would encourage you all to go. They have what they call a rendezvous or a powwow, which North American Native Indians come from all over Western United States and Western Canada and converge there, and they do, it's probably 4 or 5 days of dancing. You go into what they call this arbor, which is on the outside of town, which is an open circular area with a shaded area around the perimeter of it. And in the middle, the dancers, they're called fancy dancers because of the way they're dressed. And they have numbers on them. It's interesting because they get cash awards for the quality of their dancing, the quality of their costumes and so forth. But the key here then is figure out which ones of these people are okay with having their picture made. And I can tell you from experience that they're not all okay. I've been rebuffed several times. Certain Native Americans from the past don't like people like me. Certain of them, like this gentleman, was okay with someone like me. And I've learned that if I go up if I ask, may I take your picture, if they say no, I take that and I walk away. I say, thank you very much, and walk away. I don't try to push it. You can't push it. You can't get into an acrimonious situation where you're trying to get somebody's picture because it just blows the environment you're trying to create. I did a book, oh God, it's 10 years ago now, about conjunto music. And these old guys are all entertainers, so it was easier, they're performers, easier to photograph them because they were used to being on stage, used to being seen. They were not intimidated by a photograph. They knew how to project themselves. So my job was more, let's choose a place, and then I've got to figure out how to light and how to pose them and so forth. But you still, even when you've got all that stuff locked down, you still have to decide when you snap the shutter, because that's the key. You could set this up and you could take 10 photos and they might all be mediocre because you hadn't found just that right moment. This was an album cover and in the book that I did. This is David Lee Garza, if you know him, a very, very prominent Tejano musician. This is Juan Viesca. Now, Juan Viesca played the bass, the upright bass, all of his life. And I arranged to photograph him at his house. And again, this goes back about 10 years. And I said, well, I'll look around a little bit. Well, this is not bad kind of kitchen. He's got a Last Supper on the wall. He was a very religious man. And I took a few pictures, and it was going okay. And finally he said, you ready for me to light up my bass? And I had heard that he did this, but I said, in here? Yeah. So his son was standing there. He turned the bass around. The son poured some clear alcohol on the back of it, put a match to it. You see, we're looking at the back of the bass. And as it flamed up, he's reacting to it, but he's still got a good look on his face. You take the picture. He had done that for 50 years in his performances, way before Jimi Hendrix thought about it, right? Juan Viesca was lighting his bass on fire. It was the craziest thing. I like San Antonio because of the cross-cultural currents that go through here. We've got German and Czech and Hispanic, Latino, all sorts of different things, and the way they manifest themselves, kind of a synthesis, is incredibly interesting to me. About 5 years ago, it occurred to me that the whole American cowboy thing has been done to death. But nobody has really paid much attention to some of the original cowboys who are the vaqueros in Texas. They didn't come from Europe and settle the ranches and farms out west. They came from Mexico. They were trained by the Spanish from as long ago as 1500. So I did a book about them. Now, clearly this is set up, but you still have to react to a certain moment to get an interesting photograph. This woman was a wife of a newspaper reporter who came over to interview me, and this goes back 15 years maybe. And when she was when she was facing me, she was just an ordinary kind of plump woman. But she turned her profile when she was talking to her husband, and I saw this profile, and I just said right on the spur of the moment, "Would you mind if I shot your picture?" And she said, "Yeah, that'd be all right." So we went outside and put a piece of paper up against my studio, and I gave her just an old piece of green velvet that I had, and she put it over her shoulders. And I like that picture. Have you heard of lucha libre, Mexican wrestling? Well, for a while on the west side, there was a ring, and on the weekends they would have lucha libre. It didn't last very long. And there weren't many people that went, but some of these characters that came to wrestle were unbelievable. So I went one afternoon and just invited the ones that would put up with me to kind of go off away from the ring and then get in their poses, El Scorpion or whoever it was. And again, you see the edge around this. This was shot with a big camera. We'll talk about that in a minute too. This is James Leja down at the San Fernando gym. I've shot boxing for years and years and years. Most of my life I've shot film, and the Selena photographs are all shot with film. If you go in and see the way the photographs are presented, there's an edge around the photo itself, a black edge around it with little numbers and letters and things, and that's my way of reminding people that this was shot with film, it was not shot digital. This is the camera or a camera similar to what I shot Selena with. Now this is, a minute ago I was talking about medium format, 2 1/4 by 2 1/4 inch. That's on a roll of film that has 12 exposures on it, would go through this camera. This camera pretty much, at least when I was shooting Selena, pretty much has to be on a tripod. And each time you take a picture, you have to wind the film forward. So you can't shoot very quickly, but you got to be ready to go. You've got 12 shots, and then there's this break while you load film again. And you can't let the atmosphere in the room subside too much. You got to load pretty quick and keep going, especially if you got somebody like Selena that's really, come on, let's go. I got some more stuff for you. This is what a 2 1/4 transparency looks like. If you can kind of see scale there with my thumb. It's 2 1/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches. It's also called 120 film. Now this is the other camera that I was talking about that I also used to photograph Selena. This is a 4x5 view camera, and you've seen these. You have to have them on a tripod. You can't handhold them, really. So it's even slower to operate than the 2 1/4 camera, but you get this gorgeous big piece of film that you could just dive in and swim around in forever. That's what it looked like. You see the scale with my thumb there. The photos in the show were taken in 2 time periods, and a lot of this is on the card in there, so I'm just sort of repeating what you already know. The first session was in 1992, and it was a result of a phone call from Mas magazine, which was a Latino-centric magazine out of New York, all in Spanish. And they called me, "Do you know Selena?" Well, I'd heard of Selena, but I knew she was a singer, and I knew she was beginning to kind of make a place for herself, but I had no idea how popular she was at the time, or nobody had any idea how popular she would become. So I set up, they said, "We want to do a cover story," which means you have to give them some pictures that will look good on the cover, and then they will do an article inside with 3 or 4 more pictures. So you have to give them a lot of stuff to look at. So I set up 3 situations in my studio down at Blue Star. And as we would set up in one situation, like the curtain and the floor, which you see has been reimagined in the show up here, which I think is a brilliant idea. We'd kind of shoot this. She'd suggest different costumes. We'd change things. She was the one that gave me. I was, in a way, just kind of, I'd set up the world, made her feel comfortable, and then she gave me an enormous amount, and I just recorded it with my camera. I just chose the moment when I thought it was right, and I recorded it. But you talk about somebody that the camera loves. This is a 4x5 sheet of film. Now, I want to talk just a second, a little sidebar about smiling for a photograph. When photography first, we heard a little bit about photography at the introduction. When it first was invented in the 1830s, it was very much a rich man's sport because it was expensive, it was dirty, the equipment was very rare. You almost had to not have a job and have independent wealth to devote enough time to make something happen with it. And around the turn of the century, George Eastman, who you've heard of, Kodak, was the first one that saw that maybe the common man might like to take pictures too, and he introduced the Brownie, the little black box that maybe some of you have seen on your grandmother's shelf. For $5, you could buy a camera loaded with film. You'd take however many exposures. You'd send it off to Eastman Kodak in New York. They would develop the film, print the prints, and then send you back a new camera with film in it for $5. And people at first, well, this is a novel thing. What do I take pictures of? And pretty quickly, people sort of got the idea that, well, we'll take pictures of special events. My daughter's having a birthday. Maybe we should take some pictures, and then we could remember the birthday. Okay, that makes sense. And Grandma's and Grandpa are having their 50th anniversary. That makes sense. And so you start taking pictures, and then people see somebody, this kind of new idea, somebody recording something with this box. Well, look, come on, let's look like we're having fun. So come on, let's get together now, let's look like we're having fun. Well, what does that mean? We smile for the camera. That's an invented thing, that you smile for the camera. It wasn't always the case. As a matter of fact, there's a group of people in western Montana called the Hutterites. They are like Amish. They live communally. They dress in old-fashioned ways. They don't have radios and telephones. They certainly don't have cameras and TVs in their lives. And I was able to kind of work my way into one of the colonies and began to take some pictures, got permission to take some pictures of some of the little kids. Beautiful little kid, and the first time I held my camera up in front of one of the little kids, because they have no tradition of smiling for a photo. He probably had never had his photo made. He just stood there with a deadpan face. And I was struck by that because now, if you put a camera up in front of somebody, you have a hard time getting them not to smile, right? And people think, well, this is just Selena smiling. Actually, I told Selena, don't smile. And she didn't smile for long enough and then started cracking up. And then I got this. So I have to work hard when I'm photographing people. Okay, don't smile. And that's hard for some people to do because it's like the smile just sort of pops out. See how she's so physically at ease with herself, so poised and composed and graceful. The second photo shoot I did was for Texas Monthly. She was still alive. They called me. Selena's gotten to be this regional and almost national, international phenomenon. We're going to do another story about her. So I called and made arrangements for her to meet me at the Majestic Theater. I don't know, it was a Tuesday, it doesn't really matter. And she showed up with her dad. She had been 2 days of shooting TV commercials for Coke locally, and that's exhausting, very fatiguing. I thanked her profusely for even showing up. after all that, the work that she just put in. And she came in and she said, "Yeah, I'm really tired. I'm sorry, I'm really tired." So as a photographer's responsibility is kind of to assess the situation and go with what you're presented with. So it very quickly became clear to me that I wasn't going to get her to put tights on and start dancing around at the Majestic, because that would have been insensitive to her, and it wouldn't have worked. She was exhausted. So I went with the place that she was that day and tried to build on that. So it seemed to me that we sit her down or we pose her, we don't get her to emote, we don't get her to perform, to project. We photograph where she is, where she was that day, and not smile. It was not a smiley day. And I frankly think photographs of people not smiling are more beautiful and more mysterious. Photography is a very mysterious medium. They're more compelling where people aren't smiling. These are just a couple. This was the first magazine, the one that I told you about, that called me to do the very first shoot of her, and this is what the cover was. There were a couple of Texas Monthly covers, but mostly most of the requests I got for my photographs happened after she was killed. And this is my favorite one of all time. I got a note from DJ Stout, who was the longtime photo editor at Texas Monthly, handwritten note from him after this issue came out, and he said, "This is the best cover I've ever done." And I still have that note. I treasure that note. There it is.
Who was the man who gave you the note to?
I'm sorry?
Who was the note from?
DJ Stout. He was the photo editor and art director at Texas Monthly for many years, and was responsible for Texas Monthly's heyday as being one of the most important magazines in the country in terms of the way it looked, primarily in terms of the way it looked. They had good writing too, good content, good editing, but his design of the magazine was just second to none. Yes, ma'am.
My question is about film versus digital. Do you use both, and if so, what causes you to, use one or the other?
I was very late coming to digital. I'm not an early adapter, as they say, and a lot of my friends who had moved to digital were making fun of me. But then it became, they stopped making film, and the labs that I would go to get my film processed started, no, we don't do that kind of film any longer. It became harder and harder and harder to justify shooting film. And so I switched to digital, and I shoot 100% digital now. I still, in the back of my mind, well, I want to bring out one of those big old cameras and load some film up, go shoot some big 4x5 black and white, but I don't know who would, it's hard to develop that film yourself and find somebody to develop it. But the film that I have shot over the course of my career, I'm slowly digitizing it, meaning I've got film scanners, right? All the stuff, the Selena stuff in there was scanned and turned into digital files, and then printed with high-quality inkjet printers on really high-quality paper. Whereas in the past, you would have had to take a transparency. Those are called transparencies as opposed to negative. You would have to take the transparency, you'd have to make a negative from it, and then go in the darkroom and make what they used to call a C print, a color print from it with all the chemicals and everything. It doesn't make any sense to work that way any longer. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. The only way I can get decent photos is using my editing software. And so I'm thinking about in the olden days how you get these beautiful, like everything in the picture that's supposed to be there, like before editing. You just had to have an eye to get the perfect thing, the perfect setup, and cropping was probably the only thing you could do in terms of an effect, right?
Right. Yeah, that's it. That's something else too, all the software, the Photoshops and everything. I mean, a lot of photographers have used use the photographic act, taking a picture with a digital camera, just almost like a sketchbook, just assembling just sort of bits and pieces. Then they get on Photoshop and they do all this wizardry to it and make make something, an illustration from the photos, but it's more about the technique of using the software and things. That's beyond me. And I still think that there is a truth in seeing the subject, reacting to the subject at the right moment. I think, and every time I do that, I get butterflies in my stomach because I'm so excited to see what the result is. I don't know what it is, but I can't get enough of it, and I've been doing it for 50 years. Okay, I'm done. Is there